Section 22 of the Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Patrick McAfee, Chicago, USA. The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin. Chapter 12. Surprise, Astonishment, Fear, Horror, Part 2. Dr. J. Crichton-Browne has given me so striking an account of intense fear in an insane woman aged 35 that the description, though painful, ought not to be omitted. When a paroxysm seizes her, she screams out, "This is hell! There is a black woman! I can't get out!" and other such exclamations. When thus screaming, her movements are those of alternate tension and tremor. For one instant she clenches her hands, holds her arms out before her in a stiff, semi-flexed position, then suddenly bends her body forwards, sways rapidly to and fro, draws her fingers through her hair, clutches at her neck, and tries to tear off her clothes. The sternocleidomastoid muscles, which serve to bend the head on the chest, stand out prominently, as if swollen, and the skin in front of them is much wrinkled. Her hair, which is cut short at the back of her head, and is smooth when she is calm, now stands on end, that in front being disheveled by the movements of her hands. The countenance expresses great mental agony. The skin is flushed over the face and neck, down to the clavicles, and the veins of the forehead and neck stand out like thick cords. The lower lip drops and is somewhat everted. The mouth is kept half open, with the lower jaw projecting. The cheeks are hollow and deeply furrowed in curved lines, running from the wings of the nostrils to the corners of the mouth. The nostrils themselves are raised and extended. The eyes are widely opened, and beneath them the skin appears swollen. The pupils are large. The forehead is wrinkled transversely in many folds, and at the inner extremities of the eyebrows it is strongly furrowed in diverging lines, produced by the powerful and persistent contraction of the corrugators. Mr. Bell has also described an agony of terror and of despair, which he witnessed in a murderer whilst carried to the place of execution in Turin. On each side of the car the officiating priests were seated, and in the center sat the criminal himself. It was impossible to witness the condition of this unhappy wretch without terror, and yet, as if impelled by some strange infatuation, it was equally impossible not to gaze upon an object so wild, so full of horror. He seemed about 35 years of age, of large and muscular form, his countenance marked by strong and savage features, half naked, pale as death, agonized with terror, every limb strained in anguish, his hands clenched convulsively, the sweat breaking out on his bent and contracted brow. He kissed incessantly the figure of our Savior, painted on the flag which was suspended before him, but with an agony of wildness and despair, of which nothing ever exhibited on the stage can give the slightest conception. I will add only one other case, illustrative of a man utterly prostrated by terror. An atrocious murderer of 2 persons was brought into a hospital under the mistaken impression that he had poisoned himself, and Dr. W. Ogle carefully watched him the next morning while he was being handcuffed and taken away by the police. His pallor was extreme, and his prostration so great that he was hardly able to dress himself. His skin perspired, and his eyelids and head drooped so much that it was impossible to catch even a glimpse of his eyes. His lower jaw hung down. There was no contraction of any facial muscle, and Dr. Ogle is almost certain that the hair did not stand on end, for he observed it narrowly, as it had been dyed for the sake of concealment. With respect to fear, as exhibited by the various races of man, my informants agree that the signs are the same as with Europeans. They are displayed in an exaggerated degree with the Hindus and natives of Ceylon. Mr. Geach has seen Malays, when terrified, turn pale and shake, and Mr. Bro Smith states that a native Australian, being on one occasion much frightened, showed a complexion as nearly approaching to what we call paleness as can well be conceived in the case of a very black man. Mr. Dyson Lacey has seen extreme fear shown in an Australian by a nervous twitching of the hands, feet, and lips, and by the perspiration standing on the skin. Many savages do not repress the signs of fear so much as Europeans, and they often tremble greatly. With the Kafir, Gaika says, in his rather quaint English, the shaking of the body is much experienced, and the eyes are widely open. With savages, the sphincter muscles are often relaxed, just as may be observed in much frightened dogs, and as I have seen with monkeys when terrified by being caught. The erection of the hair. Some of the signs of fear deserve a little further consideration. Poets continually speak of the hair standing on end. Brutus says to the ghost of Caesar, "That makes my blood cold, and my hair to stare." And Cardinal Beaufort, after the murder of Gloucester, exclaims, "Comb down his hair. Look, look, it stands upright." As I did not feel sure whether writers of fiction might not have applied to man what they had often observed in animals, I begged for information from Dr. Crichton-Browne with respect to the insane. He states in answer that he has repeatedly seen their hair erected under the influence of sudden and extreme terror. For instance, it is occasionally necessary to inject morphia under the skin of an insane woman who dreads the operation extremely, although it causes very little pain, for she believes that poison is being introduced into her system, and that her bones will be softened and her flesh turned to dust. She becomes deadly pale, her limbs are stiffened by a sort of tetanic spasm, and her hair is partially erected on the front of the head. Dr. Browne further remarks that the bristling of the hair, which is so common in the insane, is not always associated with terror. It is perhaps most frequently seen in chronic maniacs, who rave incoherently and have destructive impulses, but it is during their paroxysms of violence that the bristling is most observable. The fact of the hair becoming erect under the influence both of rage and fear agrees perfectly with what we have seen in the lower animals. Dr. Browne adduces several cases in evidence. Thus with a man now in the asylum, before the recurrence of each maniacal paroxysm, the hair rises up from his forehead like the mane of a Shetland pony. He has sent me photographs of 2 women taken in the intervals between their paroxysms, and he adds with respect to one of these women that the state of her hair is a sure and convenient criterion of her mental condition. I have had one of these photographs copied, and the engraving gives, if viewed from a little distance, a faithful representation of the original, with the exception that the hair appears rather too coarse and too much curled. The extraordinary condition of the hair in the insane is due, not only to its erection, but to its dryness and harshness, consequent on the subcutaneous glands failing to act. Dr. Bucknell has said that a lunatic is a lunatic to his fingers' ends. He might have added, and often to the extremity of each particular hair. Dr. Browne mentions as an empirical confirmation of the relation which exists in the insane between the state of their hair and minds, that the wife of a medical man who has charge of a lady suffering from acute melancholia, with a strong fear of death for herself, her husband, and children, reported verbally to him the day before receiving my letter as follows: "I think Mrs. will soon improve, for her hair is getting smooth, and I always notice that our patients get better whenever their hair ceases to be rough and unmanageable." Dr. Browne attributes the persistently rough condition of the hair in many insane patients in part to their minds being always somewhat disturbed, and in part to the effects of habit, that is, to the hair being frequently and strongly erected during their many recurrent paroxysms. In patients in whom the bristling of the hair is extreme, the disease is generally permanent and mortal, but in others in whom the bristling is moderate, as soon as they recover their health of mind, the hair recovers its smoothness. In a previous chapter, we have seen that with animals, the hairs are erected by the contraction of minute, unstriped, and involuntary muscles, which run to each separate follicle. In addition to this action, Mr. J. Wood has clearly ascertained by experiment, as he informs me, that with man the hairs on the front of the head, which slope forwards, and those on the back, which slope backwards, are raised in opposite directions by the contraction of the occipito frontalis, or scalp muscle, so that this muscle seems to aid in the erection of the hairs on the head of man in the same manner as the homologous peniculus carnosus aids, or takes the greater part, in the erection of the spines on the backs of some of the lower animals. Contraction of the platysma myoides muscle. This muscle is spread over the sides of the neck, extending downwards to a little beneath the collarbones and upwards to the lower part of the cheeks. A portion called the risorius is represented in the woodcut. The contraction of this muscle draws the corners of the mouth and the lower parts of the cheeks downwards and backwards. It produces at the same time divergent, longitudinal, prominent ridges on the sides of the neck in the young, and in old, thin persons, fine transverse wrinkles. This muscle is sometimes said not to be under the control of the will, but almost every one, if told to draw the corners of his mouth backwards and downwards with great force, brings it into action. I have, however, heard of a man who can voluntarily act on it only on one side of his neck. Sir C. Bell and others have stated that this muscle is strongly contracted under the influence of fear, and Duchenne insists so strongly on its importance in the expression of this emotion that he calls it the muscle of fright. He admits, however, that its contraction is quite inexpressive unless associated with widely open eyes and mouth. He has given a photograph, copied and reduced in the accompanying woodcut, of the same old man as on former occasions, with his eyebrows strongly raised, his mouth opened, and the platysma contracted, all by means of galvanism. The original photograph was shown to 24 persons, and they were separately asked, without any explanation being given, what expression was intended. 20 instantly answered intense fright, or horror. 3 said pain, and 1 extreme discomfort. Dr. Duchenne has given another photograph of the same old man, with the platysma contracted, the eyes and mouth opened, and the eyebrows rendered oblique by means of galvanism. The expression thus induced is very striking, the obliquity of the eyebrows adding the appearance of great mental distress. The original was shown to 15 persons. 12 answered terror or horror, and 3 agony or great suffering. From these cases, and from an examination of the other photographs given by Dr. Duchenne, together with his remarks thereon, I think there can be little doubt that the contraction of the platysma does add greatly to the expression of fear. Nevertheless, this muscle ought hardly to be called that of fright, for its contraction is certainly not a necessary concomitant of this state of mind. A man may exhibit extreme terror in the plainest manner by death-like pallor, by drops of perspiration on his skin, and by utter prostration, with all the muscles of his body, including the platysma, completely relaxed. Although Dr. Browne has often seen this muscle quivering and contracting in the insane, he has not been able to connect its action with any emotional condition in them. Though he carefully attended to patients suffering from great fear, Mr. Nicole, on the other hand, has observed 3 cases in which this muscle appeared to be more or less permanently contracted under the influence of melancholia associated with much dread, but in one of these cases, various other muscles about the neck and head were subject to spasmodic contractions. Dr. W. Ogle observed for me in one of the London hospitals about 20 patients, just before they were put under the influence of chloroform for operations. They exhibited some trepidation, but no great terror. In only 4 of the cases was the platysma visibly contracted, and it did not begin to contract until the patients began to cry. The muscles seemed to contract at the moment of each deep-drawn inspiration, so that it is very doubtful whether the contraction depended at all on the emotion of fear. In a 5th case, the patient who was not chloroformed was much terrified, and his platysma was more forcibly and persistently contracted than in the other cases. But even here there is room for doubt, for the muscle, which appeared to be unusually developed, was seen by Dr. Ogle to contract as the man moved his head from the pillow after the operation was over. As I felt much perplexed why, in any case, a superficial muscle on the neck should be especially affected by fear, I applied to my many obliging correspondents for information about the contraction of this muscle under other circumstances. It would be superfluous to give all the answers which I have received. They show that this muscle acts, often in a variable manner and degree, under many different conditions. It is violently contracted in hydrophobia, and in a somewhat less degree in lockjaw, sometimes in a marked manner during the insensibility from chloroform. Dr. W. Ogle observed 2 male patients suffering from such difficulty in breathing that the trachea had to be opened, and in both the platysma was strongly contracted. One of these men overheard the conversation of the surgeons surrounding him, and when he was able to speak, declared that he had not been frightened. In some other cases of extreme difficulty of respiration, though not requiring tracheotomy, observed by Drs. Ogle and Langstaff, the platysma was not contracted. Mr. J. Wood, who has studied with such care the muscles of the human body, as shown by his various publications, has often seen the platysma contracting in vomiting, nausea, and disgust, also in children and adults under the influence of rage, for instance, in Irish women quarreling and brawling together with angry gesticulations. This may possibly have been due to their high and angry tones, for I know a lady, an excellent musician, who, in singing certain high notes, always contracts her platysma. So does a young man, as I have observed, in sounding certain notes on the flute. Mr. J. Wood informs me that he has found the platysma best developed in persons with thick necks and broad shoulders, and that in families inheriting these peculiarities, its development is usually associated with much voluntary power over the homologous occipito-frontalis muscle, by which the scalp can be moved. None of the foregoing cases appear to throw any light on the contraction of the platysma from fear, but it is different, I think, with the following cases. The gentleman before referred to, who can voluntarily act on this muscle only on one side of his neck, is positive that it contracts on both sides whenever he is startled. Evidence has already been given showing that this muscle sometimes contracts, perhaps for the sake of opening the mouth widely, when the breathing is rendered difficult by disease, and during the deep inspirations of crying fits before an operation. Now, whenever a person starts at any sudden sight or sound, he instantaneously draws a deep breath, and thus the contraction of the platysma may possibly have become associated with the sense of fear. But there is, I believe, a more efficient relation. The first sensation of fear, or the imagination of something dreadful, commonly excites a shudder. I have caught myself giving a little involuntary shudder at a painful thought, and I distinctly perceived that my platysma contracted. So it does if I simulate a shudder. I have asked others to act in this manner, and in some the muscle contracted, but not in others. One of my sons, whilst getting out of bed, shuddered from the cold, and as he happened to have his hand on his neck, he plainly felt that this muscle strongly contracted. He then voluntarily shuddered, as he had done on former occasions, but the platysma was not then affected. Mr. J. Wood has also several times observed this muscle contracting in patients when stripped for examination, and who were not frightened, but shivered slightly from the cold. Unfortunately, I have not been able to ascertain whether, when the whole body shakes, as in the cold stage of an ague fit, the platysma contracts. But as it certainly often contracts during a shudder, and as a shudder or shiver often accompanies the first sensation of fear, we have, I think, a clue to its action in this latter case. Its contraction, however, is not an invariable concomitant of fear, for it probably never acts under the influence of extreme prostrating terror. Dilation of the pupils. Gratiolet repeatedly insists that the pupils are enormously dilated whenever terror is felt. I have no reason to doubt the accuracy of this statement, but have failed to obtain confirmatory evidence, excepting in the one instance before given of an insane woman suffering from great fear. When writers of fiction speak of the eyes being widely dilated, I presume that they refer to the eyelids. Monroe's statement that with parrots the iris is affected by the passions, independently of the amount of light, seems to bear on this question. But Professor Donders informs me that he has often seen movements in the pupils of these birds which he thinks may be related to their power of accommodation to distance, in nearly the same manner as our own pupils contract when our eyes converge for near vision. Gratiolet remarks that the dilated pupils appear as if they were gazing into profound darkness. No doubt the fears of man have often been excited in the dark, but hardly so often or so exclusively as to account for a fixed and associated habit having thus arisen. It seems more probable, assuming that Gratiolet's statement is correct, that the brain is directly affected by the powerful emotion of fear and reacts on the pupils. But Professor Donders informs me that this is an extremely complicated subject. I may add, as possibly throwing light on the subject, that Dr. Fife of Netley Hospital has observed in 2 patients that the pupils were distinctly dilated during the cold stage of an ague fit. Professor Donders has also seen dilation of the pupils in incipient faintness. Horror. The state of mind expressed by this term implies terror, and is in some cases almost synonymous with it. Many a man must have felt, before the blessed discovery of chloroform, great horror at the thought of an impending surgical operation. He who dreads as well as hates a man will feel, as Milton uses the word, a horror of him. We feel horror if we see any one, for instance a child, exposed to some instant and crushing danger. Almost everyone would experience the same feeling in the highest degree in witnessing a man being tortured or going to be tortured. In these cases there is no danger to ourselves, but from the power of the imagination and of sympathy we put ourselves in the position of the sufferer and feel something akin to fear. Sir C. Bell remarks that horror is full of energy. The body is in the utmost tension, not unnerved by fear. It is therefore probable that horror would generally be accompanied by the strong contraction of the brows. But as fear is one of the elements, the eyes and mouth would be opened and the eyebrows would be raised, as far as the antagonistic action of the corrugators permitted this movement. Duchenne has given a photograph of the same old man as before, with his eyes somewhat staring, the eyebrows partially raised, and at the same time strongly contracted, the mouth opened, and the platysma in action, all affected by the means of galvanism. He considers that the expression thus produced shows extreme terror with horrible pain or torture. A tortured man, as long as his sufferings allow him to feel any dread for the future, would probably exhibit horror in an extreme degree. I have shown the original of this photograph to 23 persons of both sexes and various ages, and 13 immediately answered horror, great pain, torture, or agony. 3 answered extreme fright, so that 16 answered nearly in accordance with Duchenne's belief. 6, however, said anger, guided no doubt by the strongly contracted brows, and overlooking the peculiarly opened mouth. 1 said disgust. On the whole, the evidence indicates that we have here a fairly good representation of horror and agony. The photograph before referred to likewise exhibits horror, but in this, the oblique eyebrows indicate great mental distress in place of energy. Horror is generally accompanied by various gestures, which differ in different individuals. Judging from pictures, the whole body is often turned away or shrinks, or the arms are violently protruded, as if to push away some dreadful object. The most frequent gesture, as far as can be inferred from the action of persons who endeavor to express a vividly imagined scene of horror, is the raising of both shoulders, with the bent arms pressed closely against the sides or chest. These movements are nearly the same with those commonly made when we feel very cold, and they are generally accompanied by a shudder, as well as a deep expiration or inspiration, according as the chest happens at the time to be expanded or contracted. The sounds thus made are expressed by words like or ugh. It is not, however, obvious why, when we feel cold or express a sense of horror, we press our bent arms against our bodies, raise our shoulders, and shudder. Conclusion. I have now endeavored to describe the diversified expressions of fear, in its gradations from mere attention to a start of surprise, into extreme terror and horror. Some of the signs may be accounted for through the principles of habit, association, and inheritance, such as the wide opening of the mouth and eyes, with upraised eyebrows, so as to see as quickly as possible all around us, and to hear distinctly whatever sound may reach our ears. For we have thus habitually prepared ourselves to discover and encounter any danger. Some of the other signs of fear may likewise be accounted for, at least in part, through these same principles. Men, during numberless generations, have endeavored to escape from their enemies or danger by headlong flight, or by violently struggling with them, and such great exertions will have caused the heart to beat rapidly, the breathing to be hurried, the chest to heave, and the nostrils to be dilated. As these exertions have often been prolonged to the last extremity, the final result will have been utter prostration, pallor, perspiration, trembling of all the muscles, or their complete relaxation. And now, whenever the emotion of fear is strongly felt, though it may not lead to any exertion, the same results tend to reappear through the force of inheritance and association. Nevertheless, it is probable that many or most of the above symptoms of terror, such as the beating of the heart, the trembling of the muscles, cold perspiration, etc., are in large part directly due to the disturbed or interrupted transmission of nerve force from the cerebrospinal system to various parts of the body, owing to the mind being so powerfully affected. We may confidently look to this cause, independently of habit and association, in such cases as the modified secretions of the intestinal canal and the failure of certain glands to act. With respect to the involuntary bristling of the hair, we have good reason to believe that in the case of animals this action, however it may have originated, serves, together with certain voluntary movements, to make them appear terrible to their enemies. And as the same involuntary and voluntary actions are performed by animals nearly related to man, we are led to believe that man has retained through inheritance a relic of them, now become useless. It is certainly a remarkable fact that the minute unstriped muscles, by which the hairs thinly scattered over a man's almost naked body are erected, should have been preserved to the present day, and that they should still contract under the same emotions, namely, terror and rage, which cause the hairs to stand on end in the lower members of the order to which man belongs. End of section 22.